the lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It was a Tuesday morning at Elmore Junior High, but something felt different from the moment Gumball and Darwin walked through the front doors. The hallways were unusually quiet, with only the sound of their footsteps echoing against the lockers. Miss Simeon's classroom was empty when they arrived, though her coffee was still steaming on the desk, as if she had just vanished mid-sip. Darwin noticed at first the family photos in the hallway display case were wrong. Instead of showing happy students with their families, every single photograph showed the same thing. Empty rooms with chairs pushed back, as if everyone had suddenly stood up and walked away. Gumball laughed it off, but his voice cracked slightly when he tried to make a joke about it. During lunch, the cafeteria was packed with students, but nobody was eating. They all sat perfectly still, staring at their untouched trays with wide, unblinking eyes. When Gumball tried to get Penny's attention, she turned toward him with that same vacant stare, her mouth moving silently as if she was trying to speak, but no words would come out. The strangest part was the new student who appeared in their afternoon class. Nobody had seen him before, but somehow everyone seemed to know his name was Marcus. He sat in the back corner, never speaking, never moving, just watching everyone with eyes that seemed too large for his face. When the teacher called on him, Marcus would simply point to another student, and that student would answer instead, always giving the exact same response in the exact same monotone voice. That afternoon, Gumball and Darwin decided to follow Marcus home. They watched from a distance as he walked through the empty streets with jerky, unnatural movements, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He led them to an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town, its windows boarded up and yard overgrown with weeds. In the basement, they discovered the truth. Marcus stood among dozens of old television screens, all showing surveillance footage of the school from above. The students moved like tiny figures in a maze, following invisible patterns. Marcus himself was no longer recognizable as human. His form shifted and blurred like a badly tuned signal. They ran. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out. The next morning, everything was back to normal. Marcus was gone, as if he had never existed. The teachers had no memory of him. The students acted like nothing had happened. But sometimes, when Gumball and Darwin looked carefully, they could still see the patterns, the invisible strings, and they knew that somewhere Marcus was still watching.
The lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It started when Gumball found an old yearbook in the school library that nobody remembered being there. The pages were filled with photos of students he'd never seen before, all wearing the same uniform as Elmore Junior High. But something was wrong with their faces. They all had the exact same smile, perfectly identical, stretching just a little too wide. Darwin noticed it too when Gumball showed him during lunch. The orange fish pointed at one particular photo, a blue cat that looked exactly like Gumball, but with that same unsettling smile. The name underneath read, Gumball Watterson, class of 1987. But that was impossible. Gumball was only 12 years old. Miss Simeon snatched the yearbook away when she saw them looking at it. Her usual grumpy expression was replaced by something Gumball had never seen before: fear. She locked the book in her desk drawer and told them to forget they ever saw it. But forgetting became impossible when they started seeing those students in the hallways. At first, it was just glimpses. A flash of that identical smile disappearing around a corner. The sound of footsteps that didn't match any visible students. Lockers opening and closing by themselves. Then Penny approached Gumball after class, but her usual sweet voice sounded different, mechanical. When she smiled, it was that same perfect too-wide smile from the yearbook. The next day, more students had the smile. Tobias, Carmen, Banana Joe, one by one they were changing. They still acted normal, still talked and laughed, but their smiles never wavered, never changed. Even when they were supposed to be sad or angry, that smile remained frozen on their faces. Gumball and Darwin tried to tell Aeneas, but when they found her in the library, she was reading the same yearbook. She looked up at them with that terrible smile and said in a voice that wasn't quite hers, "Don't you want to be in the yearbook too? Don't you want to belong?" The brothers ran home, But their house felt different. Family photos on the walls showed the Wattersons with those same smiles. Nicole was cooking dinner in the kitchen, humming cheerfully. But when she turned around, her face wore that identical expression. Richard sat in his chair, watching TV, that smile never leaving his face even as he laughed at the show. Gumball grabbed Darwin and they hid in their room, but even there they weren't safe. Their reflections in the mirror began to smile that smile. Even when their real faces showed terror, the reflections moved independently, waving at them, beckoning them to join. The yearbook appeared on Gumball's bed, open to a page with 2 empty spaces. One labeled Gumball Watterson, and another labeled Darwin Watterson. As they watched in horror, their photos began to materialize on the page, but their faces in the pictures were already wearing those perfect, identical smiles. Darwin's reflection stepped out of the mirror first, that smile stretching across his orange face. Then Gumball's reflection followed, both of them reaching toward their real counterparts with arms that moved too smoothly, too perfectly. The real Gumball and Darwin backed against the wall as their smiling doubles approached, speaking in unison with voices that sounded exactly like their own, but somehow completely wrong. "Join us," they said, their smiles never wavering. "Be perfect. Be part of the yearbook. Be part of Elmore forever." The last thing Gumball remembered was the feeling of that smile spreading across his own face, unstoppable and permanent. When he looked in the mirror the next morning, he couldn't remember why he had ever wanted to frown. The yearbook sat on his nightstand, the lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It started on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning at Elmore Junior High. Gumball and Darwin walked through familiar hallways, their footsteps echoing strangely in empty corridors. The school felt different somehow. Miss Simeon's classroom was unusually quiet when they arrived. Their classmates sat in perfect rows, faces turned toward the blackboard with expressions of blank contentment. Penny's shell gleamed unnaturally bright, while Banana Joe's yellow seemed faded. "Good morning, class," Miss Simeon announced, her voice carrying an odd, distant quality. "Today we're going to learn about permanence." The word hung in the air like a cold breath, and Gumball felt Darwin shiver beside him. As the lesson progressed, something became increasingly wrong. Their friends began to speak in unison, reciting facts about things that would never change, never grow, never leave. Their voices blended into a monotonous drone. When Gumball tried to interrupt, the entire class turned to stare at him with eyes that seemed too wide. During lunch, the cafeteria served the same meal to everyone, a gray substance that had no smell, no taste, and left no satisfaction. Students ate mechanically, their movements synchronized like clockwork dolls. Darwin whispered that he couldn't remember what food used to taste like. The afternoon brought art class, where everyone painted the same picture. A house with no doors, windows showing only darkness, and faceless figures. When Gumball tried to add color, the bright hues immediately faded to lifeless gray. By the time school ended, Gumball realized the changes weren't limited to their classmates. The walk home felt longer than usual, familiar streets stretching endlessly ahead. Street signs pointed to places that didn't exist. At home, the Watterson house appeared normal from outside, but inside everything felt off. Family photos showed the same poses, but expressions seemed frozen. Nicole greeted them with usual warmth, but her words came out in the exact same rhythm. Richard sat watching television that showed only static. When asked what he was watching, he replied it was his favorite show, the one that never ended. Aeneas looked up from a book with blank pages. That night, Gumball lay in bed listening to sounds of his family going through nightly routines, but the sounds repeated in perfect loops. Nicole's footsteps, Richard snoring, Aeneas turning pages. As days passed, Gumball noticed that time itself seemed stuck. The clock showed the same time every morning, and the calendar never changed. His family continued their routines with mechanical precision. The most terrifying realization came when Gumball looked in the mirror and saw that his own reflection had begun to match the others. His expressions were becoming fixed. In his final moments of awareness, Gumball understood that Elmore was becoming perfect, a place where nothing unexpected could happen, where every day was exactly like the last. The lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It was a Tuesday morning at Elmore Junior High, but something felt different from the moment Gumball and Darwin walked through the front doors. The hallways were unusually quiet, with only the sound of their footsteps echoing against the lockers. Their classmates were there, but they moved in perfect synchronization, their heads turning in unison as the brothers passed by. In their classroom, Miss Simeon stood at the blackboard, writing the same equation over and over again. When Gumball raised his hand to ask a question, she turned around with a smile that stretched too wide across her face. Her eyes had become completely black, reflecting nothing. The other students continued to stare straight ahead, their expressions blank and identical. During lunch, Gumball noticed that everyone was eating the same meal, a gray, shapeless substance that seemed to move on its own. When he tried to speak to Penny, she responded in a voice that wasn't quite hers, speaking words that made no sense, but somehow felt terrifyingly important. Darwin tugged at his brother's sleeve, pointing to the cafeteria windows where the sky had turned an unnatural shade of purple. The school bells began ringing continuously, a sound that grew louder and more distorted with each chime. Students started walking in perfect lines toward the gymnasium, their movements mechanical and precise. Gumball and Darwin tried to resist, but found their own feet beginning to move against their will, following the crowd down corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they remembered. In the gymnasium, Principal Brown stood on a stage that hadn't been there before, speaking in a language that hurt to hear. The words seemed to crawl into their minds, making them forget who they were and why they had been afraid. One by one, their classmates' faces began to change, becoming smooth and featureless, like unfinished drawings. Gumball felt his own face beginning to change, his distinctive features starting to fade. Darwin's orange color was draining away, leaving him pale and empty. They tried to call out to each other, but their voices were becoming the same monotone sound that everyone else was making. The last thing Gumball remembered was the realization that this wasn't just happening at school. Through the windows, he could see that all of Elmore was transforming, becoming a place where nothing was different, nothing was special, and nothing would ever change again. The episode ended with the Watterson house completely silent, the family sitting motionless at the dinner table, their eyes reflecting the same empty darkness that had consumed everyone else in their perfect, terrifying world. The lost episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that never aired. It was Tuesday morning at Elmore Junior High, but something felt wrong from the moment Gumball and Darwin walked through the front doors. The hallways seemed longer than usual, stretching endlessly, and the familiar student chatter was replaced by unsettling silence. Their footsteps echoed strangely. In first period, Miss Simeon was nowhere to be found. Her desk sat empty, with only a piece of chalk writing itself across the blackboard. The words appeared slowly. Today's lesson is about disappearing. Their classmates sat motionless, staring straight ahead with blank expressions. Penny was there, but her shell looked different. Dark, jagged cracks pulsed across its surface. When Gumball tried to speak to her, she turned her head completely around, her eyes now hollow black voids. The lunch bell rang distorted, like it was playing backwards and forwards simultaneously. In the cafeteria, Banana Joe told jokes to an empty table, laughing hysterically while tears streamed down his face. Tobias stood frozen, his rainbow colors draining away until he was just a gray silhouette. Darwin noticed their reflections in the windows weren't moving with them. Instead, their mirror selves pointed frantically behind them, mouths open in silent screams. When they turned around, nothing was there, but their reflections had vanished entirely. In the library, Carmen read a book with blank pages, turning each empty page carefully. When Gumball asked what she was reading, she looked up with a smile too wide. "The story of everyone who used to be here," she whispered. As the day progressed, students began to fade. First, their voices became whispers, then their colors dulled, and finally they became transparent before disappearing. Bobert was the last to go, his voice glitching. "Error. Students not found." By the final bell, Only Gumball and Darwin remained. The hallways now felt impossibly short, with doors leading to rooms that couldn't fit in the building. They walked in circles, passing the same lockers repeatedly. The exit doors wouldn't open. Every push made them swing inward instead of out, leading back into the school. The windows showed only darkness outside, as if the world beyond had ceased to exist. In the principal's office, they found a note in handwriting that kept changing. The school remembers everyone who attended, but sometimes forgets to let them leave. As night fell inside the school, they heard faint sounds of their missing classmates. Voices echoed from within the walls, calling for help. The school had collected them all. The final horror came when they realized they were beginning to fade too. Their bright colors became muted, their voices quieter. They tried to run, but their feet barely touched the floor. In the last moments before disappearing completely, Gumball whispered, "At least we'll be together." But Darwin's response came from far away. The school had won.